Hey Christina, how are you doing?
Good, thanks.
I'm glad to hear. So, tell me about yourself, like your research and everything about that.
Okay, well, I am the executive director of the Recycling Council of Alberta, and I think you wanted to mostly talk about extended producer responsibility, and that is something that we have been advocating for years, literally years. So, as part of that, we have done a fair amount of obviously a lot of education, but a lot of research too in terms of what the situations have been in other jurisdictions, what nuances have worked, but what hasn't. So, and the benefits, like some of the benefits that actually can result from EPR. So, yeah, we've been really invested in this topic for a long time.
Okay. Would you like to tell us more about it?
Sure. So, extended producer responsibility, just as the name implies, what it is traditionally waste and the management of waste has been the responsibility of municipalities. So if you live in a municipality, they generally either themselves or through a contractor would collect both your waste and your recyclables. So under EPR, what happens is that responsibility is shifted upstream so that the actual producer who makes the product or the package then becomes responsible to make sure that that material is properly managed at the end of its life. And that is a fundamental difference because putting the producers in responsible for the actual outcome of what they produce, of course, sends a ton of signals to them in terms of what they are actually producing.
Okay. So essentially, it's just having the producers take the burden of the externalities associated with their products, correct?
Yes, and I'm not sure I would even use the word burden because in some cases what's interesting, what has happened is some of the producers actually are starting to see this not necessarily as just a burden, but an actual opportunity for them to have access to the materials that they need if they're going to actually try to enter into a full circular economy where they actually play a role in making sure that those materials then don't just end up being thrown away, but instead become part of a system where they can come back and be used again within the same product. So really, it's amazing to see how the producers have really gotten engaged in this and see their role as being really important, number one, but also as an opportunity for them, especially within their sustainability goals, because they recognize that they do have a higher order responsibility in terms of the environmental outcomes that they produce.
I'm glad you said that because commonly, well, at least how I saw it was that it's just the burden, like the cost associated with actually having to deal with the materials in the waste product because it does add a lot of, it complicates the cycle. Instead of just cutting it off and having consumers deal with it, then they have to go and the producers have to go and deal with it after. But now that you've said that, it's not so much of a burden because they're accessing the materials from it. I think that's quite interesting.
Well, and I think one of the really important things with EPR is when you look at the sort of capabilities and the role that municipalities play, they are not integral to that system. They do not understand the real details of the system as a whole, whereas the producers do. So if you were to identify who has the most ability to actually make changes for the better in the system, it is not the consumer, it is not the municipality, it is the producers that really need to be involved. And that's why EPR can be such a fundamental change mechanism in terms of actually producing better outcomes.
Okay. So would that mean that the publicly funded plants and processes, would they still be used, like municipal recycling plants, or would the producers take the entire responsibility for that and create their own recycling plants, or even contract it to another firm that deals with recycling itself?
That exact question that you just asked is exactly the kind of question that we get from municipalities that have not been through the process yet and wonder, okay, what's this going to mean to us? And that is absolutely so. The danger of things like stranded assets are very real, that there's nothing that requires a producer to utilize existing infrastructure. But from an efficiency point of view, obviously they want to do that if they can. If it's an efficient piece of infrastructure that, or one that maybe just needs to be slightly retrofitted, just about guaranteed that will get utilized going forward, because the producers will just step into that role. But it has to be effective. So if it is not a useful piece of infrastructure, it may not get used. So this is one of the things that happens as soon as the producers then take over the system, and they look at it from a provincial point of view rather than a municipal point of view. What they will do is they will look at what they need to achieve throughout the province, and they will figure out where all the pieces fit. So depending on where the infrastructure is and what its capabilities are, it may or may not become part of the ultimate system.
Okay. So it's more so whatever is more efficient, whatever's the best fit.
Absolutely.
Whether they use existing public facilities or create their own.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, and then since we're on that topic of using public facilities or not, could this potentially benefit like local economies? Like, could it create jobs, especially in terms of recycling?
Well, it absolutely can. And actually, this is one of the pieces of research that we did when we were advocating for EPRs in the last couple of years. We actually had a firm undertake some research in terms of if we could there is going to be an increase in the amount of material recycled. So if that happened, what would the impacts be? And one of the impacts definitely is more jobs. And that is because recycling produces considerably more many times more jobs than any sort of disposal method, whether it's landfill or waste to energy. They all require a lot less in terms of human resources. But I think one of the questions you're asking is, what about the local community? Is each individual local community likely to have more jobs as a direct result of recycling? And that may or may not be true depending on the location. Because again, it's about efficiency. So these provincial systems are designed to be very efficient. And that may mean in some communities, there's less infrastructure than there are in the bigger ones. So some of the things tend to be more centralized. And in that case, you actually may almost get a loss of jobs in a particular smaller community. It really depends on, again, what makes the most sense from a system standpoint. One thing that happens too is because you have the producers who represent a lot of material together, you get the orders of magnitude that actually makes sense to have some of the investment in more sophisticated technology. So that is an important thing to consider as well. So that you're not going to have that really sophisticated plant, for example, in every single community. If we look at Alberta, you probably only need one or two of that level of sophistication.
Yeah, because it's not very feasible to have like every single community and like a state-of-the-art recycling plant, because it will the cost.
Exactly. Yes, for sure.
Because who's going to pay for that?
Yeah, that's right. And that's
don't want to.
For sure.
Government won't want to. Neither will the local denizens, like the constituents.
Yeah,
that's going to be their own tax money. They won't want to put that forward. But if there's like a few big ones, and like the most like highly traffic areas and areas that have a lot of traffic going into them, so the waste would just go there automatically. Essentially, then I think that would make the most sense.
Well, the flow it becomes very logical, because right now it's like every single municipality is trying to figure out, okay, we're going to collect material from our citizens, and then we are going to ship it to whoever is going to give us the best price. And so that happens on an individual municipality basis right now. But when EPR comes in, again, you get those orders of magnitude where you have economies of scale that mean that you're able to actually negotiate based on all the material produced in the whole province rather than just the material that's produced in your local town.
What would the startup costs be? Like, how difficult would the transition be for producers to get into this? How I meant incentive was more so that them knowing that they can access the recycled materials afterwards and use them for the products again.
Yes. Yeah, no, absolutely. And again, that is for the ones that really are motivated to enter into a circular economy and have fairly aggressive social and environmental objectives, then that makes a big difference because they start to consider those aspects in the design of their product as well as the system, because remember, now they are actually managing the system as a whole. Yeah. Once EPR comes in, they actually then have to consider, okay, well, what's going to happen to that package at the end of its life? Because we're going to have to look after it. That's a consideration they do not make right now, but they definitely make that once EPR is implemented.
What would cause a business to adopt this model, aside from environmental reasons and the raw materials afterwards?
There's only one reason. There's only one reason, and that is what EPR is based on. It's regulation. So the regulation, what it does is it lays out the outcomes that the producer is expected to achieve. And then government backs away and says, okay, you do this. We expect you to make sure that whatever the number is, 75% of your material is properly recycled at the end of its life. And you have to prove to us that you've accomplished that. That is what produces the change. So that's why these systems are all based on, they're all regulatory. So you have to have a regulated outcome to be able to actually get behavior change from the producers.
And who regulates it?
The provincial government. So okay. EPR waste in general is actually a provincial jurisdiction. So even today, like all of the waste regulations are at a provincial level, but so it's EPR is no different. So the province brings in a regulation that actually lays out what has to happen under an EPR system, and then the producers have to achieve that.
Okay. That makes more sense, because I was wondering, I felt like if no one was governing it, if no higher body was regulating, then the producers, they probably wouldn't start it.
Absolutely. It doesn't. So it does not happen without the regulatory mechanism. So, but in addition to the regulation, you hinted at something that's very important. So you need the regulation, but you also then need to monitor the actual outcomes. So there have to be consequences if the producers do not meet their goal. So you basically set out what it is you expect them to achieve, and then you have to have some kind of a punishment or a consequence if they do not achieve that outcome.
What would the punishments or consequences be? Any ideas?
Yeah, it depends on where you are. This is one piece that honestly has not always been as well implemented as it could be, because generally what's happened, it's interesting actually. It's interesting how businesses behave, because once you create the regulation, most of them will aggressively go after that target, and they will try to achieve it. So in general, governments have not had to pay as much attention as they should to the actual consequences if they are unsuccessful. But it is critical to have that so that it's a level playing field and everybody has to try to achieve those outcomes. And also, as our standards get higher, we need to make sure that we are continuing to encourage producers to achieve those outcomes. So the actual consequences that work are obviously finances work really well. And there are some provinces like Quebec where for certain materials, if you don't achieve your target, you actually get a monetary penalty. That can be very, very effective. The other thing that is, there's a couple other things that are very effective. One is simply because the whole idea of being environmentally responsible is important to a company's basically how their customers feel about them. So if
Yeah, I was
they
gonna,
if
I was gonna touch on that.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, if there's a public record of, okay, this company did not meet their target, they try to avoid that because that looks really bad for them.
Yeah, well, you just answered my question. Like the next one I was going to ask. I was going to ask, like, would it be the public perception of them not meeting the targets driving them, or would it be more so the government penalties? But it appears to me that is both, and that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it's both. But what's interesting is when you actually talk to the jurisdictions that already have these systems, they actually tell you that that whole public perception piece is perhaps the strongest trigger.
No, because you've seen companies fall in their eyes due to public perception.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because image is everything, especially in business, and that's why marketing is so integral to many businesses. Before I touch on how this would look in Alberta, how did it look in Europe? Because I know Europe did catch on to this idea quite a few years back.
Yeah, and it's interesting because Europe on most environmental issues, things happen in an order. Europe happens first, then we follow them, and then the Americans follow us. So that tends to be the order of the way that things happen. So we have been watching what happens in Europe. Remember, their regulatory system is slightly different, so there are nuances, but definitely if you watch what has been happening in Europe, they are very serious about EPR. So EPR has been integrated into most of their systems, and they, as a result, have because they've had it for longer than we have, we've been learning from them in terms of the things that work and the things that don't work. So there have been a number, for example, of the organizations that actually end up running the systems. There's quite a few of those in Europe, and you almost get them in a competitive situation as well. So it's not just the individual companies, but it's these organizations that actually run the recycling systems enter into it as well, and you get competition between them, and the competition in these situations is always a good thing.
Okay. And then what about on a smaller scale? Like, would smaller businesses be expected to follow this, or is it more so for the large corporations with the larger outputs?
It is mostly for the large ones, and this is interesting because we end up struggling, especially organizations that are like ours that are very philosophically based. We want to make sure that there's a level playing field and everybody has to meet the standards that have been set out. But that being said, there are a number of these really small businesses, like really small, where the administrative burden of even participating is more than the benefit that we get out of it. So usually what happens is they call it de minimis, but what it is businesses that are under a certain size may end up being exempt from having to actually participate because the actual reporting and all the paperwork required is overwhelming for everybody when all of those little companies are involved. And that's why they've actually traditionally done that in most jurisdictions, especially for things like packaging.
Okay. Next, aside from the paperwork, I would find it a bit difficult for smaller businesses, well, just basically to do it.
Yeah.
If they're not generating enough revenue. It's just economies of scale, essentially.
Absolutely, you've nailed it. That's absolutely it.
Expensive for the smaller guy, whereas the larger guy, it's the drop in the bucket.
No, for sure. No, that's absolutely why they do it that way. And I don't know whether this is going to, like, I think eventually as the systems evolve, it will embrace more and more of the companies down to a smaller level. But right now it is because when you actually look at the biggest producers, they are so much bigger than the small ones, where the handful of big companies will produce way more than a whole bunch of the small ones put together.
And how would this roll out in Alberta? Because I know we did touch on it a little bit, but I think we should get a bit more specific here. And how would it look in Alberta?
Okay, so what's happening in Alberta is, first of all, they had to change the actual legislation, the Environmental Protection Act, that actually allows EPR to happen. So that happened in the fall. Now what they're doing is Alberta Environment is nose to the grindstone writing the regulations now for the recycling component, which falls under the Environmental Protection Act. So, but it is only right now, initially there's only two materials being captured. One is packaging and printed paper, and the other one is household hazardous waste. So those are the two materials that are initially being captured. And others then will be added on later on, because introducing these regulations, there's work involved in that as well. So they had to pick the priority items first, and that's what they've done. Now they expect those regulations to be actually released at the end of the spring sitting, which I believe is at the latest the end of June. So that's going to happen. We'll actually have regulations, and then the producers will have clarity around what it is that they're expected to do, and they will have a certain amount of time to implement those regulations and have them actually up and running.
Okay. And then since you said that only paper and hazardous materials are being included right now, well, plastic, like my background is well, this plastic bottles, because that's what my CSO placement is. Like when would plastic be included in that?
It is included. So right now, any plastic that is a beverage container already is part of the deposit system.
Okay.
So that's already in existence in Alberta, but any other plastic packaging. So think about what municipality are you in?
Edmonton.
You're in Edmonton. Okay. So think about the materials that you put out for recycling. Everything that is in that container is captured under what's called PPP. So it's either packaging, or packaging includes all plastic packaging. So packaging and paper. So those two. So it's not paper only, it's paper and all packaging that includes plastic, metal, paper, any packaging. So anything that basically you bring into your home that's a package is covered under that system. So it is the biggest, and that's why they actually did it first, because it is the biggest amount of material.
Okay, let me see if I have any examples in here about the wrapping plastic you put over stuff. Can this be recycled?
Yes, and that is very likely to be included in the system. But the one thing I will say is that is what's going to be in the regulations. So the regulations define what's in and what's out. So we don't know exactly what is going to be in, other than it's likely to be like it is in the other jurisdictions. So if you look, for example, at BC, who's had an EPR system for a number of years already, you'll see the list of materials that are included, and it basically is pretty much everything that was collected curbside. So that does include film plastic as well as hard plastic, and basically anything that could be considered a package.
Is there a place where people can access this information online?
Absolutely. So BC has a really good website. There's a couple of different places you can go to look, but Recycle BC is that producer responsibility organization I was talking about that has their members are all of those producers. And if you go onto their website, Recycle BC, you'll see the list of everything that is accepted to be within the EPR system in BC.
Okay, how about for Alberta? Do we have one yet?
So BC does, because this is the other thing that happens. Sorry, I should have clarified this before. So as soon as it becomes EPR, it becomes a provincial system. Right now, you might be able to recycle something in Edmonton, but if you go to Sherwood Park, it might be a different list, which is completely nonsensical. And then you go to St. Albert and it's different again. Or you go, like that makes no sense to anybody. So this is one thing that happens with EPR is you end up with a provincial system, and that is defined by the municipality right now. Once it becomes EPR, it will be defined by the producers, and it will be the same across the province.
Wait, so does that mean that Edmonton, St. Albert, and Sherwood Park, do they all have different recycling plants and waste management facilities?
They probably have different contractors is probably the way it works. Edmonton does some of their own. So it depends on, some municipalities actually collect their own recycling. And then they have a plant, like Edmonton has a recycling plant, and that recycling plant may also take materials from other municipalities as well. So then those other municipalities may actually end up being consistent with the list from Edmonton, but it may actually not be your next door neighbors that use that plant, because they might actually contract with a different provider who uses a different plant. This all gets really confusing. And it's one of the reasons why you can see why consumers just throw their hands up, say, we don't really understand. And so the idea of having a provincially consistent list of what is accepted is so beneficial.
And how much of it actually gets recycled? Because I've heard some kind of abysmal numbers.
And this is another, again, this is an answer I have no choice but to say it depends, because it does. So one of the things that has to happen, and this happens more under EPR, because remember, under EPR, the producers are told you need to achieve this recycling rate. That recycling rate has to be verified and has to be real. So it is real recycling. Right now, a municipality may not be really diligent about making sure that all of their material is recycled. They may not ask the right questions. They may not even know what the right questions are. So we get a lot of wish cycling where we collect materials and just hope they get recycled. Sometimes they may, sometimes they might not. But generally, we do not do as good a job of recycling as we should, because we do not pay enough attention to making sure that the material that we're actually sending for recycling is high quality.
Okay. And I was always told this as a kid. I'm not too sure how true it is, but do they pick through the garbage and pick out recyclable materials, or is that a myth?
That's a complete myth. And it's also doesn't make any sense, because one of the keys to having quality material is source separation. You cannot mix materials together and then separate them and expect to have quality. You're not going to have quality. So there is not such a thing right now, certainly not in our province, of a facility that can take garbage and separate it into materials that can be recycled. That is completely, that's a dream. Like that is not reality at all. So the good facilities can take, for example, they can take a mixture of plastics and they can separate those plastics into different types, and then they have a much greater chance of being recycled. But if those plastics were in the garbage stream, you're not ever going to be able to recycle them because they're dirty.
Okay, but don't they clean them when you get to the plants?
Yeah, there is an element of that for sure, and things like getting the labels off them and all that. But that only works to a certain degree. If it's too dirty, it's just not feasible to actually clean the material. So it needs to be relatively pure. The more pure it is, the higher the quality. The best example of that is, again, we talked about the beverage container system before. So if you go to a bottle depot and you look at how they separate their materials, that is the cleanest recycling system on the planet. And as a result, they get the highest price for their materials. They don't have to worry about whether they have a market because they have the highest quality materials. So if you produce good materials that are source separated, they are going to be able to be recycled. And then from there, as they get dirtier or more mixed, you have a less likelihood they're going to get recycled.
Okay, so separation is key. Separation.
It absolutely is key. Yeah.
And how many times it depends on the product and the kind of plastic, I would suppose, but like how often can something be recycled? Is there any evidence?
There is, but that's a very complicated question, because again, it depends on the type of plastic and it depends on the type of process. So theoretically, you should be able to recycle plastic if you treat it properly and it does not get degraded through the process and is not too contaminated. You could theoretically recycle it many, many, many times. But if it's contaminated or mixed or in some other way compromised, you're obviously going to be able to recycle it less times. So there is no magic number other than just recognizing that the cleaner, the better.
Okay. And then would it just become waste or did it actually degrade? Like the more times you put it through the cycle, assuming it's
Yeah, as much as
perfect life.
if it becomes too compromised, then it honestly becomes waste. And that is why it's so important when we're actually monitoring to see how the material is recycled. We have to make sure that that material that has been removed, even if it went to a recycling plant, the material that gets pulled off the line because it's not high enough quality to recycle, we need to make sure that we subtract that from the denominator and the numerator so that we're getting the right number. And this is what we don't always do so well. So we call that residual. If it gets pulled off as a residual and ends up being disposed, it cannot be counted in the recycling number.
Well, could that be used as a lower grade product?
Yeah, sometimes it can be. And a good example of that is there are some plastics that are more recyclable than others. And some of the ones that are less recyclable can be made into things like maybe they can't be made back into another container, but they can be made into things like, for example, plastic lumber, which is still a very useful product, but that material, plastic lumber, yes. So you can actually make lumber out of plastic. We have a couple of plants in Alberta that do that.
Meant to imitate lumber, or is it meant to just be a different material altogether?
It replaces lumber. So it's often used for the same application as lumber. So decking is an example that is, can really be done well with plastic lumber. You can't use it for everything, but you can certainly use it for some things. And the beauty of plastic lumber is it doesn't get damaged by the weather.
How about vinyl siding on houses? Could that be like a lower grade product?
No. Vinyl siding is a problem because it's vinyl, because it's PVC, has issues in its production as well as its recycling. It is not a highly recyclable material. I actually honestly wish that vinyl siding would just go away, partly because I think it's hideous. And I don't know why they use that. Like a much better product when you're into housing. So you're gonna actually know the name of this, that the board that actually has cement in it as well as wood.
Which one?
It has like a cement part of it as well as wood. I forget what they call it. Hardy board. Hardy board.
Hardy board. Yeah, okay.
Oh my God, that's a brilliant product and very durable and doesn't have the disadvantages of PVC because PVC has chlorine in it. So as soon as you have chlorine in the mix of the material, you get chlorine gas in the manufacturing and you get chlorine gas theoretically in the recycling. So you immediately have a hazard in the production of the material. So on multiple levels, it honestly doesn't make sense.
So vinyl siding is ugly and it's bad for the environment.
Yes, yes.
Nice. How about compared to using brick? Because, well, first of all, brick's more expensive. And I believe brick does have a high carbon output, the manufacturing process. But what about using natural materials like brick and even like cement and stucco? Because I love the way that stucco looks. Like it's, you can say it's outdated, but I think it looks amazing, really.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I agree. And those materials tend to be more durable. And then when they get to the end of their life, they tend to be they have less impacts in disposal as well. So see, these are the things that we need to consider when we're designing everything, is we need to design them from a full life cycle perspective, where we don't just look at the immediate application. We look at how the material is made, how long its life is, and how it can be managed at the end of its life. Like we need to look at it from that perspective, rather than just looking at the immediate 5 years of its life. That is all we really seem to pay attention to.
Wow, what about like hemp? Like using hemp to make plastics? Because I believe that's the thing. Can that be?
You know what, you can, the interesting question, we don't see a lot of hemp in making plastic, but theoretically, you can use any carbon base to make plastics. So that's where you end up with these biodegradable plastics, some of those. So you can make them from any type of, really anything that's a carbon-based material. So plants, you can make them from straw. There's all kinds of applications where you can actually, it really just comes down to the chemistry. So the chemistry allows, all you need is carbon and hydrogen, and you can actually make plastic.
Well, what about the environmental effects of that?
Well, see, this is
It's
the
still a
thing.
chemical, but when it biodegrades and breaks down, what happens to that?
Well,
Like,
and this
if
is,
I
this is,
ate that,
yeah.
that's a silly question. Like, if I ate like a biodegradable plastic made of like plant oils per se, like would that be toxic to me? Because I would assume it
No,
would.
no,
No?
no. And plastics in general, other than possibly, now even PVC is inert once it's produced. Plastics are quite inert, so they're not poison, although now we're starting to see the impacts of the small pieces of plastics. So they're
Okay,
called
the
microplastics.
And with
And
the biodegradable plastics are microplastics.
well, and see, this is the thing. Everybody thinks that biodegradable plastics are the answer, but they are not, because two things
Okay.
happen. One thing that happens is you cannot tell them apart from regular plastic. So they get mixed into the plastic mix, and then they can contaminate the recycling process. So the proper application for biodegradable plastics is that they need to be used in applications where they immediately end up in a composting system. That's the only thing that they're good for. And there's very few of those. So if there's a danger of them actually just getting mixed in with other plastics, then they disrupt the system and they're not a good thing. So they are not the answer. There are some applications that they could make sense, but only if it's a composting system.
Okay, so in terms of extended producer responsibility, this would just create a headache.
Yes. Well,
Yeah.
any recycling system may create a headache.
Okay. So they need to be used very carefully and skillfully.
Yes, and
So
that's
they're
it.
more
It's
like a
not.
marketing gig right now.
Yeah.
Like yeah, okay.
Well, this is what's happened. So there were a bunch of stores that decided to start buying compostable plastic bags because they were better than plastic bags. Well, they're not, because if they just end up in, a lot of them just end up in the landfill anyway. There's no advantage to a biodegradable plastic bag in a landfill versus a regular plastic bag. They just cost you more money when you first bought them. So, there's no real advantage to that, because materials do not degrade in a landfill. That's not what landfills are designed to do. So biodegradable plastics belong in one place, and that's an actual composting system.
And did he provide any benefit to the soil? Like, what if farmers started sourcing biodegradable plastic and use that on their farms? Would that benefit them, or would it just
use it for what? It depends on what they used it for.
Composting the plastic, would that provide the soil any nutritional benefits?
Oh, any organics do. So yeah, there's any organics that can be properly composted are a great valuable material for farmers, for sure. Compostable plastics, as long as they'll actually properly degrade in the system, and that is not always guaranteed, because a lot of things that are sold as being compostable or biodegradable may not actually break down. Like, they certainly wouldn't break down, for example, in your backyard composter, but they might break down in a more high-tech composting system. So again, right material for the right application. That's you have to look at it from a systems point of view.
Okay, because I could see, like, hypothetically, that could be quite beneficial to both, well, for the producers, as a finding a way for them to deal with the plant plastic, the biodegradable plastic, and then plus I'd be benefiting another party. But it sounds like it's a bit more complicated than that. But if you brought somebody in that would actually biodegrade it for them, then they could sell that off to farmers, and that could create somewhat of a circular economy there as well.
The important thing there, though, the thing that's usually the missing link, is how do you make sure that material ends up in a composting system? That's the problem. That's the piece that doesn't happen.
So what about those, well, two questions. So would the best place to recycle those, well, to dispose of biodegradable plastics, would that be just to put them in the composting bin at home or at the mall?
No, they won't break down in your oh, you mean the one that gets collected by the city?
Yes.
Sometimes, because again, so many of these answers are, it depends. The city of Calgary did a bunch of research on this, actually, because they have a big in-vessel composter that they use to actually compost the material that's collected in their green bins. And so some materials actually do break down in their system, some don't. So it depends. But I mean, how do you as a consumer know if that plastic straw or plastic fork or plastic bag is the right kind of compostable plastic to actually break down. Extremely complicated. It's better not to go down that road. It really is.
And then my second question would be, what about the mixed plastics, like the one, like the Dasani bottles that say 30% plant-based? What's the deal with those? Like, can those be recycled or?
Yes, yeah, they can. They can.
Yeah.
And a lot of that is because, remember what I said, you can make plastic from anything, any carbon-based material. It's the same material, but from a different source.
Okay.
So it's plastic made from an actual, like, that had that particular plant type material as the origin, as opposed to one that had petrochemicals as the origin. The material is exactly the same. It's just where the original carbon came from. So that comes more from is sourcing it from a plant-based material less of an environmental impact than sourcing it from a petrochemical source like that. This is where
the source is the only difference. Like the
exactly
end
only
result
difference.
Is,
yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Oh, the source is the only difference. Then essentially, how I see it is just diversifying where we get it from.
Correct. Like you mentioned before, a lot of it's marketing.
Yeah.
So they can say this is a plant-based model, and so the average person on the street that exactly does not understand chemistry, doesn't understand that actually doesn't make any difference at all, unless you can actually do the proper life cycle assessment and find out whether there is an actual environmental advantage to doing that. That's the kind of, we have to do more of that where we really understand what we're doing.
Yeah, and plus, well, I know both production methods wouldn't be very environmentally friendly because, well, oil isn't the greatest, especially in terms of it. However, the way I see it is that if we're using all this water and energy to grow the plants, to turn into plastic bottles that could be useful as food, first of all, but also, like, that's not efficient at all.
It's exactly those issues. Those are you've nailed the issues that need to be considered whenever we're doing these things.
So and so we're using waste, like organic waste, to create the plastic.
So the thing to remember is always, remember we talked about how the origin is really important. We need to, wherever we can, we need to actually reduce the materials that we're consuming.
Yes.
So it's way more important that we don't use something than that we choose between two things that we can use. So we have to make sure we reduce. Then if it's something we absolutely need, we need to reuse it if we possibly can without having to recycle it. And then only after that do we actually then maximize the recycling equation so that we're as efficient as we can be.
Okay, and I don't mean to like debunk either of our organizations right now, but it seems like plastic bottles are the scapegoats and they receive the most attention. So well, why not just reuse them? Like, they're not dead after one use, like, clearly, because I've seen people use them as, replace them as like metal water bottles. And then plus in the back in the day, I'm pretty sure that they used to reuse the glass bottles as well, for the milk. For the milk powder companies, you could also cut the used milk jugs out of glass, same as pop bottles when they're glass, they would all reuse, or wash and reuse. So why can't we do that with plastic? Because how I see it is that if we did that, we can create another industry.
So we actually do it. We do it with, but again, it's more fundamental than that. We do it with the plastic bottles with the screw lids that everybody carries around that they drink out of. That is what we should be using. And the idea of buying bottled water is ludicrous. No. There is no reason to do that. So we need to have our own bottle that we refill with water from our potable water systems. And that has to be our first priority. Now, if you look at other things, like if you really want to pop or you want to juice, then those theoretically, yes, if they were glass, they could be reused. But what's happened is our system has changed so much. We transport materials so far. We don't just produce, milk is a good example. Milk is not bottled at your local bottlery anymore. It comes a lot further than that. It might come from Saskatchewan. It's so because of that, glass is very heavy. And so there's a lot of energy in hauling a glass container. So if we were going
So
to
is
go,
making new glass, making new materials, that uses a lot of energy.
exactly. And
Yeah.
that's what I'm saying. If we were to go back to a system where we reuse things, we would need to retool the whole system so that throughout the system, we actually tried to maximize the benefits. It's not just as simple as always doing a direct substitution, except in the cases where we reduce. Reduce is always the winner. Reducing is never the wrong thing to do. So that always has to be our fallback.
No, because that's what I've always thought is that recycling is great, but it's not always the answer. Like it's
Nope.
definitely a tool, but
Yep,
reducing is by far the best thing to do. Just reduce
absolutely.
our consumption, reuse things, and then recycle them.
Yeah, recycling has become the environmental panacea, and it's because we're lazy and
Yes.
because we see that as an easier answer, but we need to get away from that. We need to go back to the first two R's before we recycle.
How would you see EPR working in smaller rural communities, especially Indigenous communities?
You know, this is a good question, and I hope we actually have time to answer this because this is one of the unknowns. But I can tell you what's happened in other places, other jurisdictions, like, for example, Manitoba and BC. Those communities have traditionally been very underserviced when it came to things like recycling. They just don't have the same level of service. But what's happened with EPR is, again, remember the producers are involved. The government has, in some cases, basically said to them, look, we expect you to give the same level of service to these communities as you do to all the other communities. And so what they end up doing is they end up having to get creative about how they can actually provide services to those communities, because there's a real danger otherwise that they will either continue to get a lower level service or even get no service. So that has to be something that the governments consider, and they tend to have done that so far. They actually make it, and it might almost be easier for them when you think about it to tell a producer, look, we expect you to service these communities than it is for them to do it themselves. So, but that has worked out in everybody's favor. There are some amazing programs that have developed in places like northern Manitoba, in communities that traditionally have gotten no service, that are now starting to get service, and it's starting to build. So we just have to make sure that in those outcomes that we define, that level of service does not discriminate against small or any sort of disadvantaged community. Everybody needs to have a reasonable, it might not be same, but it has to be a reasonable level of service.
For the producer, there would obviously be some fiscal challenges by doing this. Would there be any fiscal benefits, or would it more so be following with morality and avoiding government penalties?
Yeah, I think initially it's more the latter, that they do it because they have to. But again, you're starting to see these producers emerge as recognizing that a lot of them have already internally made these decisions that they're going to pursue a circular economy. And EPR helps them to do that. Otherwise, they're not necessarily that equipped to enter a circular economy. But as soon as they become part of these systems and really embrace the whole life cycle of their product or their package, that gives them definitely an advantage to be able to accomplish those circular economy outcomes ultimately in a much more effective way than they could without EPR.
Okay. And then, do you feel there's room for the local manufacturers or remanufacture of plastic at the location to become waste, particularly for rural and remote communities? So essentially, like, is there a benefit for them to remanufacture it at the location that it becomes waste, or is it easier just to bring it to central locations?
I wish the answer to that was yes, but I would have to say the answer is generally no. There are other advantages and other jobs that can materialize at the local level, but they are unlikely to be reprocessing because those tend to be pretty high tech facilities, which need to be a large enough scale to actually make sense. So there's no reason though why a community that is perhaps not wouldn't normally be thought as the obvious location for a reprocessing facility could actually become the location for that facility. But there's not going to be one at every, you're not going to get one in every small community, I think is my point. And it's not like these things are easily scaled down where you can just do them on a minimal basis. They tend to require a certain amount of material to be effective.
Okay. So, at least in my mind, I think the best approach for smaller communities that wouldn't qualify for having the manufacturing plant at their location, I feel it would be for them to all have their own smaller collection facilities, because those can be quite small scale.
Yes.
And
yes.
if they do that, they'll be separating their waste at the location before it's shipped off. Plus, it'll be creating some jobs for the local constituents. Do you think that would be the best approach?
I agree. And I think as part of that, again, remember we're doing this on a provincial level. So it cannot be an individual community saying, you know what, I think we'll do this. We need to all get together and say, okay, we have this many communities that it makes sense to put this in this community and we'll put this in this other community, rather than making all these independent choices about what we individually want to do. We need to think of it on a provincial basis. So that can absolutely really be a benefit to certain communities, but we need to work together so that we're not stepping on each other's toes and that the system overall remains efficient.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. How long do you think it will take for extended producer responsibility to be implemented in Alberta? And how about for all of Canada as well?
Okay, well, it already exists in every other province except Alberta.
Really?
Yeah, we're kind of the last, although the Maritimes is just starting to introduce some of the elements. So remember, there's other materials. There is actually, because BC has 20 some EPR programs. So you've got PPP, you've got HHW, you've got used oil, you've got tires, you've got electronics, you've got a whole list of things that all then eventually end up being captured under EPR. So BC has the most advanced system to date. They have the most programs, but the other provinces are all starting to adopt these. So eventually, to do it all across Canada, there was initially an intention for every province to have EPR before 2020, and that didn't happen. But I think you're going to see it's really starting to get momentum, and I think you're going to see pretty much everybody with EPR by within 5 years. But in Alberta, so we're doing PPP, HHW, and the regulations passed this spring, and then the actual programs will be implemented probably within 2 years. So you're going to actually see it on the ground operating within 2 years by 2024, essentially. So that will happen, but at the same time, they will start expanding to other materials as well. So you're going to see them starting to add on it. Like, for example, one is agricultural plastics. We know that should be handled under EPR. And you're going to start adding on some of these other materials as well. So you'll just start to get an expanded list of materials that are all covered under EPR. And eventually what will happen too is we already have existing programs that are not EPR for tires, electronics, oil, paint, and those will be transitioned over into EPR eventually, and that probably will not happen for 5 years. So I'm thinking within 10 years, we're going to have the full range of materials like BC does under EPR, but it's not going to be within a couple of years.
Okay. And then this reminds me of like the reclamation. Like this reminds me of how oil companies are supposed to reclaim the land after they're done
Yep.
with it.
Yep.
However, many of them will file for bankruptcy and will no longer be held accountable. Do you think that would be an issue with in terms of recycling? And if so, how would you combat that?
You mean for the producers, that the producers might go broke? This is one of the advantages of having a producer responsibility organization. So they actually operate the system for all of their members. If one of their members goes broke, that just gets picked up by the other members.
Okay.
So that's why there is a real advantage in them working together like that. So it's not just dealing with the particular plastic packaging that came through Canadian Tire. It's plastic packaging that came through everybody. So if Canadian Tire closes their doors, it doesn't matter because that's still a package. Yeah, and it still get captured under that system because all of the other members are still around and they understand that it's their job to actually recover all of those packages.
Okay, so instead of having regulations that tell individuals that they must follow these guidelines, it's more so that there's a unifying body that upholds these guidelines and regulations. Is that what I'm hearing?
But that happens not because the regulation tells them it has to happen. The regulation applies to individuals. The individuals choose to get together because they know that it's more efficient to work together. So that's how the PROs happen, is they get together because they know it makes sense, and it's easier for me as a producer to assign that responsibility to an organization that represents me and all my friends, rather than me having to figure it out for myself. But at the same time, there is a role for individual producer responsibility too. If your material or your product, whatever it is distinct enough and there's an advantage, you can be innovative in coming up with a system to handle your material that actually is just as effective, maybe more efficient than working with the group. So that alternative exists.
Okay, that makes sense. That's everything I have for now. Do you have anything you want to say?
No, I've been babbling for an hour, so it's fine.
This was actually quite enjoyable. I really enjoyed it. It's a really good plan too. Like if there's, you guys can cover everything. It sounds like there's very little ways to actually attack you guys.
Okay, hopefully.
Yeah. But yeah, it's
Okay.
a pleasure meeting you, Christina. And
Yes,
I wish you the
absolutely.
best.
Okay, great. Okay, see you, Logan.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye.
Bye.